It's going to be at least 2.5 lectures. Probably one of the most popular elements or UI elements in the entire app world or UI table views. So you need to know what they are, you need to know how to interact with them. And then we'll have our final exam, which will be some kind of lab. It won't be like the midterm, it'll be like more like a lab. A small lab, but a lab, something that you can do in 2.5 hours. All right, any questions about that? All right. Do I have anybody in the waiting room? The midterms that I did grade were good. How did you guys find the midterm? Easy, hard, in the middle? Well, all of you finished. I don't think anyone had time issues. All right, so let's go through it quickly. And then you guys can ask questions along the way. And if you don't have questions, we can move on. All right, so number one, create a variable with an inferred data type. So inferred data types means I create a variable and I just assign something to it. Bar x equals 5, right? X is going to be an integer, and that's inferred, right? Meaning I didn't explicitly state that it's going to be an integer. Next one is create a constant. So I have to use the let keyword with an explicit data type. So I have to tell the compiler what data type it's going to be. So let y string equal hello. Right. So constant, I use let keyword. And y is my variable name. It's explicit. So I have to say string with the colon notation. And then I assign the value. Next is create an array of strings and assign the following names to the array. Yeah. For our names equals, I'm going to do it this way, inferred, like this. And yeah. Or do it like this too. There's other ways. These are two of the ways you could have done it. Questions about anything so far? Okay. Create a variable as an optional, and then print the value to the console without the optional wrapper using forced unwrapping. So for my name question mark, I'm sorry, string question mark. Something like that. So I'm trying to run this code. It'll take a minute. Yeah, so here's my output in the console down here. And I believe if I remove this exclamation point, it's going to give me the optional. So to unwrap it, you need the exclamation point. And that's forced unwrapping, right? I'm simply saying, I know this is an optional, and I want you to unwrap it and give me what's inside. But I don't care if it's nil. All right, next, write a function that accepts two parameters, num1, num2, and then returns num2 plus num1. Okay, so functions start with a func keyword, and I have to give it a name, and then I have to give it a return value. And then there needs to be a body. There also have to be parameters, num1, num2, and I told you could pick whatever data types you want. I picked floats, and I'm returning a float. So I can actually do this in one line and say return num1 plus num2. Okay. Any issues with that? All right. Write a function that accepts an array as a parameter and returns the first value. I'm going to borrow this. Array, and then I could say like I think that's right. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm returning an integer, not returning an array. So return kind of like that. So I'm passing it, I'm calling it ARR. Put a Y in there, just shorthand for array. And it's an array of integers, and I'm returning an integer because it's a single value. So I'm just returning the 0th position of my array that was passed in.
Professor, would it be correct if we chose the data type as any?
Yes, fine, no problem. This is fine. Create a variable as an optional and use optional chaining to unwrap it. So here's like my optional. My name too. So up here, you know, we did forced unwrapping with an exclamation point. Down here, I wanted you to use optional chaining. So what I want. No value. Okay. Make sense? On this. Yeah, it works. Notice I don't have to do any exclamation points. This line of code, if true, this variable actually takes on the unwrapped version of this variable, right? So I'm printing name, which is not exactly this, right? This actually took care of the unwrapping part. And if this didn't happen, if this was false, then I would just end up here. Okay. Create a dictionary that holds strings, int key value pair, so string int, and assign some values. So I want you to create a dictionary that holds some grades, right? So the name is a string and the grade is an int. So our grades dictionary. Then it's kind of like a array except dictionary. You have to provide string int. You have to provide 2 data types if you want to be explicit about it, and then you could just add them. John colon, I think, before. Let's see. Colon 2 plus colon 100. Okay. So I declared it and initialized it with some data. So my dictionaries are normally written like this, just to be clean. So I have key value pairs, John 84, Betsy 92, Chris 100. Right. And question 9 asks me to use the grades dictionary that I created up here and print the grade that Mike has. If Mike doesn't exist, the dictionary should print no Mike in class. So I want to use this structure to look at it. So if let grade equal Mike, sorry, grades of Mike, print grade, else print no Mike in class. So I'm creating a grade variable and I'm assigning the value of grade sub Mike. And if it exists, I'm going to print the grade. If it doesn't exist, if this key doesn't exist in my dictionary, then I'm going to end up here. Right? So I expect to see no Mike in class when I run this. So I'm going to run this and see what happens. Yeah, so the last output says no Mike in class, and then let me go ahead and add a Mike to my data structure here. Mike. 88. And if I run it again, I now should see the grade rather than no Mike in class, because now Mike does exist in my dictionary and I should land on here. So there it is. Okay, so up until creating classes, should have been relatively straightforward. Any questions to this point? All right. Next, building class. So first, I need to create a class. So I'm going to start with the class keyword, then the name of the class, and then open, close, bracket. So this is my class now been created. I need to put some properties in here. Put some methods in here. And then I got to see what this question is asking me to do. Okay, so I need an address, which is a string. So var address string. Then var number of stories is going to be an int, or has doorman going to be a boolean, or number of elevators int. The building should have one. So those are my properties. I asked for 4 properties. So that's the declaration of the 4 properties. It's going to start complaining that it has no initializers, which I expect to see. So the building should have one initializer method that has no parameters. So that looks like this. Init, no parameters, right? And then the body of the method. Inside it, method has no parameters and assigns the following values to the properties. So all of these will be accounted for in here. So self.address equals empty. Self.number of stories equals 0. Has anybody figured out why some of these don't go purple? I'm curious. Self dot as doorman equals false. And then self dot number of elevators equals 0. So at this point, I expect all these errors to go away because all of my properties are accounted for in the initializer. So anytime I create a building object, this method will fire, and then all my properties will take on values. Next, the building should have one method called send announcement. So that's a function with the func keyword, send announcements. And accepts a string and prints the string to the console. So it has some parameter, which is a string, and then it prints it to the console. So all it does is print message. Okay. I think that's it for this problem. Anybody have any questions or objections to this solution?
Professor, someone just asked in the chat if you're going to post this on Blackboard.
Yeah, I'll post it. Anybody else? Okay. Create an office building class that is subclass of building. So class office building building, right? We learn how to do that. So here's my office building class, and it inherits from building. The office building should define an additional property called hours of operations string. So properties, methods, the office building class has one property called hours of operation. String. The office building should have an initializer that has one parameter which sets the initial value to hours of operation. Right? So init hours. That's a string, right? And self dot. Okay. What else? Create a building object named my building. So for my building of type building. Change the parameter value of my building as follows: number of elevators to 3, number of stories to 10. So my building dot number of elevators equals 3. My building dot number of stories is 10. Print the number of elevators in my building from number 12 to the console. Print my building dot number of elevators. Create an office building object called my work building using 9 to 5 as the hours of operation. So or my work building, office building. PM call send announcements method with the my work building object using the string. So my work building dot send announcements. Then pass that string here. Okay, so here's all the output that kind of comes out when I run this version of it. Any questions about any of these? Hopefully this is straightforward. I will post it unless you guys have questions. We'll move on. Okay. Next. All right, so I want to shift away from the midterm. This was language type stuff, and want to come back into the world of what we're doing, which is Xcode and apps and user interface elements. And we did a one lab called Hello World, and we threw some elements on the board, and I'm going to go over that right now. But before I do, I want to talk about constraints, because you can't just drag stuff out onto the canvas if you're using Storyboard and expect that things are going to line up well and they're going to not cover each other or float off the side of the phone when it comes to width and height and other things like that. So you have to understand that there's something in this world called constraints and how they work. So we're going to do a very basic look at it. Then we're going to do a calculator lab that is going to force you to figure out how to deal with constraints a little bit. So you think about it, a bunch of buttons on a phone, and you have to kind of put them next to each other so they can look like a calculator. And then if you look at it on different phones and different sizes of phones, you should see how those buttons resize and how that layout resizes to make it look good on all phones, not just the one phone you were designing for. So the point here is kind of like web development. If anybody's into web development, displays come in all sorts of resolutions and sizes in web development. So if you're a front-end web developer, you have to keep that in mind and design in a way that, hey, somebody's might be looking at my website from a phone or from a computer or from a TV or whatever. So my layout needs to kind of work well with all those different devices. Idea here is the same. The devices don't vary that much, but they do vary a little bit. And when they do, your layout shouldn't break. Not only do they vary a little bit, but also they can vary quite a bit because you have landscape mode, right? So if you have your phone portrait mode, and if you flip it landscape, and if your app allows for that to happen, then your layout is going to look totally different in landscape mode, and you have to be able to handle that, otherwise it's going to break. So I'm going to introduce that today, and then we're going to apply some of those things that we learned to Lab 4. I'm going to apply a couple of constraints to the elements in Lab 4 so that you guys see it in action. And then moving forward, I'm going to always use constraints so that my layouts don't break or they don't look wonky. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to go through a couple of slides here to give you an idea of what this is about. So simply dragging objects onto Storyboard does not give us objects with any relative specs, right? It just says, okay, you just put something on the screen. While it does its best to figure out what you meant, it doesn't, it's not true to what you're looking at. When you render it, the rendering engine makes its own decisions on how big it is and how far it is from the top and how far it is from the left. Does it bump into the next element? So this is something that you have to explicitly state and think about, right? It's not just stating, but you also have to think about it. And I have a couple of very crude slides to kind of give you an idea of what the idea of constraints is and how to think about it. So first one is adding constraints to edges of screens, right? So let's think about your phone and two different layouts, one portrait mode and one landscape mode. And if you had two buttons, right? And if you want those two buttons to be consistent to the edges, what you would want to do is you want to add some kind of anchors to the top left, to the top and to the left for the left button, and then to the top and to the right for the right button. So that when the phone flips and those anchors remain in place, as long as those anchors are to the edges of the screen, you'll get what's happening here on the right. So the left layout will translate to the right layout because you've added anchors to the elements. And these anchors have to specify a couple of different things. One is how do I exist in the X position, right? Like how far am I either from the left or from the right, or am I centered, right? Also, they have to specify how do I exist in the Y position? How far down am I from the top, or how far up am I from the bottom? And then also they have to specify some kind of size, height or weight, height or width, I'm sorry, of this element. So you have to think about those three different things when you're aligning elements to your layout. Is one, where does it exist in the X position? How do we define it? Two, where does it exist in the Y position? How do we define it? And three, what is the size of the element, right? Like what's the width and what's the height? And width and height are not always going to be like actual numbers. Sometimes it'll be, I want to be as wide as a screen, right? But it has to have a very specific rule as to what the width is. Whether it's 500 pixels or the width of the screen, doesn't matter. One is relative and one is absolute, but it has to exist, whether relative or absolute. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. Questions? Now, if you don't add constraints to the left-hand side here, and you don't do anything, and you just drag a couple things, when you turn the phone, it's not going to look like this. This button here is going to kind of end up maybe somewhere in the middle of the screen, and it's going to be weird. And if there was another element in the middle here, then this button is going to like overlay it, and it's going to look like a disaster. That makes sense? Okay. And then I'm going to show one more idea, and then we'll deal with this, in the Hello World app, and then we'll go over this in a little more detail a bit later. I just want to introduce this topic as we're doing the Hello World app, so you kind of understand what I'm doing. Another idea is adding constraints from one element to the other. So if I have these two buttons, for example, the way I had them anchored at the top left and the top right, and I add another element here, right? Maybe it's a text view. I don't know. Maybe it's an image view. Who cares? Doesn't matter. Some other element beneath these two buttons. Notice here, this black arrow tells me how far it should be from this element above it. And then these arrows on the left and right tell me how far this element should be to the edges. So now notice when I flip the phone sideways, it actually stretches this element to preserve the rules of I want to be this far away from the edges, right? It preserves the height distance from this button, but it actually makes the element wider because I don't have a fixed width for this element. I'm not specifying a height here. I'm presuming it's a fixed height. So that's a way that you can create relative anchors and relative constraints. I want to be this far off this element, and I want to be this far off edges or things that may vary. So you can resize elements as your layout changes. And I want to keep it that simple for now until we get into the calculator app. But before we move on, I want to ask if you guys have any questions about these two ideas. Okay. There's a bunch to know about constraints. I'm not gonna really go over it too much. If you want to get into it, you'll have to do your due diligence, and you have to do a bunch of studying on how layouts work. This could be a course of its own. I just want you to be aware that constraints exist, and in their most basic form, allow you to create some kind of layout that doesn't break when you start introducing different phone sizes or when you start flipping the phone left and right. And this is something you have to think about. Do I want this to grow? Do I want it to be the same size? I don't know. It's something that you as a designer have to answer for yourself. And then there's a mechanism for you to implement those constraints. So how do we do this stuff? I'm going to jump out of the screen. Well, before I jump out, I'm going to show you just a couple of other screenshots, which is down here. And let me pull in like I'll start a new project for lab 4. So lab 4. All right, so started a brand new project for Lab 4, so we can do it from scratch and you guys can ask questions. But essentially, where this constraint stuff is found is when you go into your main storyboard, you see the stuff down here. This is where it lives. So when adding constraints, you're going to be living down here in these 2 or 3 different dialogues, right? So this one's manual constraints, right? It says add new constraint, and we'll explore the stuff in this box. It's relatively intuitive. You're not going to look at it and be like, oh my God, what is this? It's pretty intuitive. You're going to be like, oh, okay, I kind of get it. This is like auto layout, which says you can do things like leverage things, like allow the system to suggest constraints for you, which can be dicey. And then this is like alignment constraints, which is also pretty intuitive and a little bit more advanced. And we'll deal with this stuff when we get to the calculator. For now, we're only going to live in the manual constraints side, this thing that has a little square with like the little lines around it. All right, so how does it work? I'm going to kill this PowerPoint for a second and bring up Lab 4. So Lab 4 suggests that, where is it? Bear with me until I find the definition for Lab 4. Okay, here's Lab 4. Create a new project named Hello World, named mine Lab 4, but whatever. Anyway, so create 2 labels, head label and greeting label. Okay, so immediately I'm going to have to add constraints as I add my new elements. So first thing I have to do is I have to create a head label. So how do I do that? Well, I click on my view controller, I click on my objects library, little button here, and I need to pull a label. So I'm going to pull out a label, and this is my head label, right? Okay, so in the past, I've kind of done this and waved my hands over it and like made it a little wider. Okay, well, and that's it, and I would leave it there. This, however, doesn't have any like constraints per se. The simulator is going to try and do its best to kind of guess what I'm trying to do here, but it's not going to be consistent. So if this is to be consistent, I need to add some constraints. So first thing I want to do is I want to center my text. So I'm just going to click on this. The second thing I'm going to do is this, when you drag this around, the user interface gives you like these nice little guidelines, right? There's like this blue guideline that tells me that I'm in the center, for example. Then if I drag the edges out, there's another blue line that tells me that I'm at the end of the safety area, right? Or if I keep going all the way to the end, there's another blue line that tells me I'm to the edge of the screen. So I'm just going to go to the edge of the safety area. And then I'm going to drag this one out to the edge of the other safety area, right? Okay. Maybe I'll make it a little bit taller. And maybe I'll make my font a little bit bigger. All right, 20. Now, I've done some preliminary dragging around, but still this doesn't mean that I have constraints. I need to click on the label, which I have, and that's why you see all these squares. And then I need to click on this manual constraint section down here. And it says add new constraints if I hover over it. So when I click on it, right now I have the label selected and I have noticed the element here and it's got like little anchors that are dotted red lines for now. And there's a width and a height. So first thing I need to do is I need to answer those questions that I talked about earlier. Is how does this, exist in relative to its X position, right? Like, so here, what I want to say is, well, in the X position, I want you to always be at the safety area on the left and at the safety area on the right. So I need to add two constraints. And the way I add constraints here is just by clicking this anchor, which notice now it's a filled red line. And down here, I got a little message that says add one constraint. So before I do anything, like I can do stuff and these constraints are starting to add up. But until I actually press this button, those constraints are not going to be applied. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to instruct my constraint to say, hey, I want this label to be 20 pixels from the left and 20 pixels from the right. Right. So that's how I define where it exists in the X position. Right. It's always going to be 20 pixels from the left and 20 pixels from the right. That's an X direction. Now I have to define what it looks like in the Y direction. So in the Y direction, I need to say, well, I want it to be a certain height from the top, right? And let's make it 20 just to be consistent. And if I click this little anchor, then it tells me 20. So now I've defined how it exists in the X position with two anchors. I've defined how it exists in the Y position with one anchor, because I don't need any more than that, right? I don't need two anchors in the Y position. I just need to say, if it hangs 20 pixels from the top edge of the screen, that's enough, right? It knows exactly where that is. So now the next thing I need to do is I need to define one more aspect. Do I need to define width? And the answer is no, because the width is going to be variable. It's going to depend on how wide the screen is because of these two constraints, right? I said, always be at 20 from the front and 20 from the back, no matter what the screen looks like. So resize yourself to fit those constraints, which means I don't have to define a width. The width has already been accounted for. I do, however, have to account for a height, because the height is not accounted for since I only have one constraint that says be this far from the top. So it needs to know how tall my label needs to be. So I'm going to define a height of, let's say 40. And I'm going to hit add constraints. So now I have four constraints, the one from the top, the one from the left, the one from the right, and the height. Click add constraints. And notice these blue indicators popped up. And if you have all blue like this, then you're good, right? If I had issues, I would see some things that are not like blue. I would see some orange lines or some red lines that convey ambiguity. The UI will tell me if I'm not accounting for a width or for a height. So for me, I'm happy with this, right? I've defined where this label needs to live, and I can move on with the next thing. So let me pause here, and that was a bunch of stuff all at once, and see if anybody has questions. Questions?
So, Professor, I understand why we said that the width is going to be calculated by its own, or is going to be resized, depending on how long the sentence that we're going to put in the label is. But why did we, if it's going to be resized, why did we assign the height?
It's resized this way. It's not resized this way. It's always the same height, right? I didn't give it, like, if I gave it a constraint to the top and a constraint to the bottom, then the height would be resized, and I don't need to provide a height. So since I only gave it a constraint to the top, that means I have to provide how tall it is.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
If we give a constraint to the bottom, you mean, you know what I mean?
If you give it to the bottom and to the top, then you don't have to provide a height, because
perfect.
That's going to get calculated. Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's going to,
okay. Another question. If we did not give the anchors from the right and the left, do you think we should then add a width constraint?
Width, yes. Absolutely. So
Makes sense.
for example, so now let's play around with these, right? Okay. One thing I can do is I can click this and then click this triangle, not the square, but the triangle. The triangle is going to say clear constraints. I can clear all the constraints I just made, right?
Okay, good.
So, and you have two sections. One says selected views and the bottom one says all views in view controller. So be very careful with this clear constraints, because if you have 10 views in here that you had constraints for the last 2 hours and you click this, all of your views in there
Will be
will
gone.
lose their constraints.
Yeah.
So like if you're messing around with a single view, like use the top part which says selected view. So I selected this label, so I'm only doing this to the label. So I'm going to click clear constraints and notice all this stuff disappeared. So we can do it again. Click on the label, click on the little square here, add constraints, right? And let's do something different this time. Let's say I want to make it 20 from the top and then 500 from the bottom. And then 20 from the left. And I'm going to leave it like that. See what happens. What's going to happen here, do you guys think?
It's gonna go to the right because the right does not have any limit, any constraint.
Well, first, am I okay in the X direction? Did I properly define what it looks like in the X direction?
It's already 20 in there.
Yeah, but the X direction has to be position and width. Does it know how wide it's supposed to be? It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
The Y direction is properly defined. The position is shown with anchors and the width is calculated. The horizontal direction is, the position is 20 from the left, but the width is neither calculated nor specified. So I have I need to provide more information. It's not gonna be happy. So let's just add these 3 constraints and see what happens. So added 3 constraints, and this is what happens, right? There's a height, except I didn't want this to happen. Like this is like the width of it is ambiguous. So just notice how it's orange, and the orange part tells me that I need to solve for the width of this label, right? Notice how it became taller because I said B500 from the bottom and 20 from the top. It resized itself so that it takes on that height, but it doesn't have a width unless I say anchor it to the right or give it a specific width. It's not going to be happy. So I want to select it and I want to update it. So I want to do something like let's specify a width. Let's say 500 wide, and add one more constraint, and that's way too wide. It spills out, but it's happy. It spills out, but it's happy because it has a number. So I mean, maybe I should make it less than 500. Okay, so now I made a mistake. So what do? Where are these constraints located? If I go here to the document hierarchy, notice I have my view, I have my safety area, my label that I just added, and as I add these constraints, they pile up in here. So these constraints are actually starting to get listed here as I add them, and I could remove them. So where is this one? My width is like, where did it go? Where's the 4th constraint? This is kind of annoying, but I don't see it. Interesting. Okay, another way to remove constraints is simply to like click on them in user interface. So if I click on this like width constraint that I just added, I can click it here and then delete it, and it goes away, right? And I can do it again. So if I click on my label, give it a width constraint of like 200. And yeah, this is now a little bit better. But this is like a ridiculous looking label, so I want to fix it, make it look like a normal label. Does this make sense so far? You can go back to selected views, clear constraints, then go back to add constraints, and then do 20 from the top, 20 from the left, 20 from the right, and height of 40. Click add 4 constraints, and my label snaps right into place. Yeah. And I can type my name. Yeah, I could run it. I want to run an iPod Touch. I want to run it like an iPhone 13 or something like that. Give this a second. Yeah, notice kind of sits pretty where I put it, right? It's not off to the side anymore. Last time when we were dragging these, even though we were dragging them in the middle, they were a little off to the side. And now, if I decide to run it on a bigger device, like the 13 Pro Max, it's a bigger device, and I could run it on that simulator as well. Here's a smaller one, here's a bigger one. Got to give this a minute. The point is, this label should land exactly in the same spot in the middle, 20 from the top. And the width should be 20 from the edges as well. While this is loading, let me show you something else that's kind of cool. This is kind of annoying to have to keep running it on different, simulators. So there's a preview that Xcode allows you to have when you're doing auto layouts. So down here, like on the right side is the constraint section. And on the left side, see it says iPhone 11. If I click this, it shows me like all the different devices. So I can like see what it looks like on a smaller phone, or like, my computer's a little slow, but that simulator still loading. So that's what it looks like on a smaller phone. I could see what it looks like on an iPad. Say this one. right? So notice the iPad stretches this label all the way across. And I could change orientation. Again, the label's stuck to the top. I can change orientation again. I can change display device again, go back to phone, something larger. Ugh, I'm gonna kill the simulator because it's killing me. There we go. Okay. All right. So this is quite useful down here. Like if you click on the device that's being displayed, you have, if you want to go to the iPad side, you have like all these different iPads. If you want to go to the phone side, you have all these different phones that date all the way back to 4S. That's going to be tiny. So here's iPhone 4S, and that's what it used to look like. And notice again, my label is stuck to the top. Cool. Any questions?
Professor, when it comes to this lab, we don't really care about choosing a specific device because we're just fixing what we're just specifying how our labels and views are going to be like, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yes. As a matter of fact, earlier versions of Xcode used to just have a box here rather than anything that looked like a phone. There used to be just a square, and it was really annoying because the idea is, you should be doing auto layouts, but it didn't work very well. But what you're saying is true. Yes, it doesn't really matter which phone you pick. Pick one that you like, that makes you feel like comfortable with it. I normally pick like the non-max version of a later phone, and I use that because of this notch changes sizes, and I want to know what it looks like. But the max version is also okay. But it doesn't really matter. What you should do is like check between the two of them, right? Like as you're doing your layouts, just kind of flip back and forth a couple times and be like, let me see what the smaller one looks like. Let me see what the bigger one looks like. Make sure that we're not doing anything silly. So here's my smaller one. Here's my bigger one. And they both look pretty good. So, okay. That was label one and a lot of explanation on these couple of constraints. And then you can imagine the rest of them are going to be kind of the same. So the next thing I want to do is add another label, which is head label and then greeting label. So I want to add another label. Here's my label. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of. The nice thing about doing this is that the numbers are now start to exist. Like when I click my add constraints, like the left and right are already set at 20 because I stretched it out to those edges. So I don't have to type here. That's kind of nice. The top says 30. Maybe I want to do 20, 20, 20, 20. The height, the other one was 40. I'll make this one 40. Add those constraints and boom, this label gets kind of inserted where it needs to be. Now I want the text to be centered, and maybe I want, the font to be the same as the other one, and maybe I don't want any text in here because this is a display label, so I'm just gonna remove this text altogether. So now I have a label, it's there, it's gonna be waiting for me to send output to it. And it has constraints just like the other one, right? And they're blue, which makes me feel good. If they're orange or red, then I know I missed something. Okay, and I like to just run stuff because I want to make sure I didn't break anything. Oh, I picked a different simulator. Whoops. Kill the simulator. Let me do iPhone 13. The simulator is already loaded. Okay, so it still works. The label's there, but it doesn't have anything in it. I want to make sure that it's there. I'll just put something in here to make sure that that label's there. Okay, good. We'll remove this text in a little bit. So the next thing I want to do is I want to connect these to code before I move any further, because I'm going to need to write to this one. So how did I do that? We connect things to code by showing the R system editor. And great. So my main label, okay, this is a view controller class, and I need properties, methods. So the head label really, I don't need to change the text of this. The lab doesn't ask me to ever change the text. So I don't need this to exist as a property of the view controller. It could just sit here with hard-coded text. This one, however, I'm going to want to change the text of. So I need to have access to it. So control, click, drag. I drop it here in the properties section. The dialog comes up. I make sure that it's an outlet type connection. Give it a name, which is, what kind of name did I give it? Greeting label. All right, so I want to call this greeting label. Click connect, and it makes me greeting label property, and it's connected. If I hover over it, right, it's connected. Okay. Next, I need to create a text field. So I'm going to do the same thing, except instead of a label, I'm going to find a text field in here. Here's a text field. Pull this out. And this one, I'm going to make like, ugh. I'm not going to go all the way to the edge, just so you guys see what a width constraint looks like. So I'm going to open the constraints again. Now I'm going to have a top constraint, right? I need a Y direction. So I'm going to do, again, 30 from the top. And 30 means from this top element, which is the label element. So they're all 30 from the previous one above them. And then in order for me to exist in the Y direction, I need to have a constraint, one constraint, and then a height. So the height I'm going to keep at 40 and continue that trend. I'm going to add these two constraints. Now notice this is red here, right? Because the horizontal constraints right now are ambiguous. It doesn't know where to exist in the X direction. So in the Y direction, I defined it correctly. There's a height element and there's a distance from the top element. Now I need to define the X position. So the X position is going to be, I want it centered, right? So I click this thing here. And it says horizontally in container. So I want to center it horizontally in container. Add constraint. It's going to give me this thing. And notice how it shrunk it because I didn't give it a width constraint. So I don't want it this tiny. I want it to be, like 200 pixels or something. So I want to add width. And the width is going to be like 200. I'm going to add that constraint. And there we go. Okay, so this thing is, notice if I click on any of these, I could see their constraints. And the fact that they're all blue is good. And actually, I want this a little wider, so I'm going to delete the 200 You can just click and delete it. Go back and add another one and make it 300 or a little wider. Okay, there we go. The next thing I want to do is, because I'm going to need to grab the text from this text field, I need to connect it to code. So control click drag, connect the code, and I'm supposed to call this name text field. So it's an outlet. It's called name text field, and click connect. So now I ended up with another property to type UI text field, and it's called name text field. Okay, before I go any further, I want to see if there's any issues running this. And they're not. Here's my regular label, the label I'm going to be messing around with later in the text field. I can actually click into this text field and type. All right, so that's good. So far, so good. All right, next. Side-by-side buttons, hello button, goodbye button. And okay, so that's find buttons. There's one. And I'm going to resize it. And I can actually, like, if it's selected, I can copy and paste another button. So now I have two of them. And they kind of are nice with these alignments. Okay, so I'm going to change the text to say hello. Goodbye. And let's give them some constraints. So I'm selected. I'm going to give it say 60 from the top and 60 from the left. And then height and width, what they are, 118, 172. That's fine. And then I'll do the same for this one, except I'm going to say 60 from the top and 60 from the right instead of from the left. And then again, 118 and 72. Add constraints. So now both of these exist in space the way they like. They have a left and top and a right and top constraint, and they have a height and width. So they're fully defined how they exist in space. The next thing I want to do is I want to add these buttons or connect them to code, but I want to connect them as actions. I don't want to connect them as outlets because I don't really care to change the text or color of these buttons. I want to be able to handle the button presses. So I'm going to connect these in the methods section. So I'm going to say pressed hello button. Notice this is an action here, and if it didn't say action, I would change it to action. So connect. I get a function, right? I'm going to do the same thing with the goodbye button. I'm going to say control, click and drag. Release. Again, action, press. Goodbye. Button. Connect. I have two buttons. Those buttons have event handlers. I want to make sure that my event handlers work. So I'm going to just do quick print statements, print hello button works. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the goodbye button. Stop. Run. Let's see if pressing these buttons will print to my console these messages. And if it does, I can move on, because I know that I have event handlers at work and I can write code to satisfy the lab in these two event handler methods. So here's my app, it loads. I have those two buttons here. And if I press one, I have this output in my console, which says hello button works. And if I click goodbye, this goodbye button works. So that's great. These two buttons are correctly connected and they fire when I press them. So I can just keep clicking them and the code inside them gets executed. All right. So I have two labels. I have my input field. I have two buttons. What's next? Okay, so handle the button press, validate. Okay, enter your name. Okay. Text field is position both labels. Okay, this needs to have a placeholder text, right? This label needs to have a placeholder text. So easy way to do that is just to click on the not label, but the text field and go over to its properties here on the right. And it says placeholder. There's just here. There's a place where you can just type in, enter your name as placeholder text, right? So now it comes into my text field as this gray text. So I'm going to run this again and see what I get. There we go. Now it's time for me to kind of get rid of this text, this labeled text. I don't need this anymore. I know it's there. I'm just going to delete it. Okay. So the way this lab is supposed to work is I'm supposed to enter my name here. And then when I click the hello button, it should say hello, my name in this, or goodbye, my name in this. Okay, so before I do that, I can actually make one small change to this to see if they work inside the label. So before I do anything with what's entered here, I want to make sure that I can write to this placeholder label or to this message label here. And it's called greeting label, actually. So rather than outputting stuff to the console, I can just output to my greeting label. So self.greeting label .text equals, and I have to provide a string. So say hello, and then anything here except it says goodbye. Okay. Eventually, I'll have to put in the name of the person, and we'll see how that works. But for now, I'm going to make sure that I can print to this label, my greeting label. Okay, so if I click hello, it says hello, and if I click goodbye, it says goodbye. Hello, goodbye, hello, goodbye. Perfect. Well, the only thing I have left is to figure out how to get the name that was put into this text field and then add it to this message up here. So it's pretty straightforward to do, right? Inside of your hello and goodbye buttons, you can write code that says something like var name equals name text field text, right? And I'm getting a warning here that says it was never mutated, so consider underscore. I don't care for this. Doesn't really matter. So I can copy this and put it here, right? So anytime I push either of these buttons, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the text that's in here and assign it to this variable called name. And then I can append to this message and say, add a variable with string interpolation like this, and then put an exclamation point at the end. So this should give me like hello and then the person's name, whatever the name is in here. So let's see if that works. We got some warnings here, but we'll deal with them later. Sometimes you actually don't need to deal with warnings, you can just ignore them. But if you choose to deal with them, you can deal with them later. I just want to make sure this works. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to enter in a name here. Mike. Click. Oh, here's our friend optional. Click to buy. It works, except I'm not unwrapping my optional. So, and this makes sense because the value of a text field is always optional, because if I don't put anything here, I'm going to get nil. So that makes sense. So I have to go back here and add an exclamation point if I want to force unwrap these names, and try again, see if that works. I got rid of some of those warnings, which is good. I guess they were warning me that I'm dealing with optional values. So let's try this again. Let's go with Mike again. Click hello. Oh, that looks better. Click goodbye. That looks better. So it kind of works. A couple of things I don't like so far. Kind of like the fact that this doesn't go away when I click the buttons, like the name Mike in the text field. I expect it to like clear the text field. So let me add that function there. So I'm going to say, make my own function that clears text fields, because maybe my app later will have more text fields that I want to clear all at the same time. So I want to create a function down here called clear fields. And it's not going to accept any parameters. And for now, I only have one text field. So I'm just going to say that I'm going to clear this text field. And every time I push the button, I'm going to clear fields. I'm going to clear fields here. I'm going to clear fields here. Let's see if that works. So I created a function. All it does is it takes the name text field and it sets the text property to nothing. And I put it in a function because I'm assuming that maybe there might be other text fields later that I want to clear all at the same time, just by calling a single function rather than inputting this text. I mean, this code into the different IB actions. So let's see what happens. I'm expecting that whatever I type in the text field, when I push a button, it's going to go away after it displays the text. So if I type in something like Chris, and I click hello, it says hello, Chris, but this text field gets cleared, which is great. This is kind of what I expected. I say Mike, click goodbye, it says goodbye, Mike, and then the text field gets cleared. Okay, so far so good. And I think there's one more thing that I didn't do yet, which is validate the input. I don't want, you know, for you to not have a name here, right? I want the app to tell you that, hey, if there isn't anything here, the display message should say you need to put something there, right? Please input name. right? So how do we do that? Well, we can create a validate function. Validate text fields. Again, I'm calling it plural because maybe there's more text fields later. And we're going to return true. I'm going to return a Boolean. Right, true or false. Are they valid? So right now, what valid means is that there's text in the text field. So if self dot text, what was it called? Name text field. Name text field dot text equals nothing, then return false, else. Turn true. Okay, so I have a like tiny little function here that tells me whether or not this text field has anything in it, right? And I could write code like this here. If and then validate text fields. If that's true, I'm going to do this stuff. And if it's not, I'm going to write something to the greeting label that's different than the goodbye thing. It's going to say, please input name below. And essentially, I'm going to do the same thing with the hello button as well. This is the goodbye button. Do the same thing with the hello button. I'm going to check if I have valid inputs. So if validate text fields, I'm going to do this stuff. Else, I'm going to do this stuff. Okay. See if this works. And while I'm doing that, if anybody have any questions, please let me know. So I'm going to click hello, and there's nothing here. So it says, please input name below. It doesn't say hello or goodbye. So it's going to wait for me to put in something like Mike. And now it tells me goodbye, Mike. I click hello. It's again going to say, please input name below because it cleared the name Mike. And I can put in Chris, and if I click it, it says hello, Chris. Great, it works. Any questions? I have two elements that I deal with, right? The greeting label and a text field. And I have two functions that I deal with, or event handlers. I wrote two of my own functions. One validates the text field. All it does is it checks whether or not it's blank. And if it is, it returns false. And if it's not, it returns true. And I'm using that as a conditional, right? I'm calling this function and I'm saying, if the input is valid, you know, do all the stuff that the lab asks me to do. And if it's not valid, then you got to like display some message that's asking you to input text. And then both functions, both event handlers essentially have the same code in them, except one says hello and one says goodbye. Any questions? All right, so before we break, there's like an extra credit component here. And then we'll break, and then we'll look at lab 5. All right, so the extra credit says add a third label. And I'm going to add it down here. So here's my timestamp labels. I'm going to add a label down here. I'm going to add constraints to it. Just like I've been doing. So I'm going to center the text. Add left constraint, right constraint, top constraint, and then the only thing that's missing now is height. So we'll make height 20. We'll add those 4 constraints, and it seems to be happy. So everything's blue. I'll get rid of the text. Okay, so what does this ask me to do? Timestamp. Display the current. Oh, well, first I need to connect the code, right? Because I don't have access to this right now. So let me connect this to my code and make it an outlet. And this should be called, what is it supposed to be called? What does it say? Timestamp label. Okay. So I'll just paste that name in there, connect. So here's my timestamp label. Now I have a third thing up here. Okay, so the only thing I got to do is every time I push one of these buttons, I need to write to this label what time it is, and it should be in like some clean format like this, right? So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to create another function, one more function called get time, and now I'm going to use a date class that's available to me. So I think I told you guys here to use the date object. Yeah. So I'm going to create a date variable, and it's going to be of date type. Right? Then I'm going to create calendar variable. It's a calendar. You had to look this up. Like you wouldn't know this off the top of your head. But this is pretty standard boilerplate code. And then like I have to create an hour and a minute variable. So let hour equal calendar component. It's this one. It's like dot hour from date or something like that. All right. Then let minute equal calendar dot component. Dot minute date. So, essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating a date object and then a calendar object as well. So I have 2 objects, and then I'm creating an hour and a minute variable. So the hour variable says, well, go into the calendar object and then grab a component called hour from the date object, right? And then assign that value here. And then go in the calendar object, grab the component minute from the date object. So these two objects are kind of connected. They know about each other. And I can pull out the hour piece and the minute piece with this code. Right. So now I have the hour, the current hour, because this calendar object is being initialized to its current, whatever the current time is right now. So these two variables allow me to have the current hour and the current minute. Right? The next thing, I mean, I could stop here. I could do lots more, but I could stop here. You'll see that it's probably weird. It's going to look maybe a little weird unless I do more formatting. But essentially what I can do now, since I have an hour and a minute component, I can just write to my label, right? So I could say time stamp label dot text equals, and I have to provide them a string, right? Because it's text. So hour backslash hour, which is this hour, the value, and then this, and then minute. So I have the hour, I have the minute, and I can do a little string interpolation and put the hour here, then a colon, and then the minute here. Let's see what happens. Oh, nothing's going to happen because I'm not calling this function ever. Okay, cool. It's nice to write functions, but if you never call them, they don't do anything. So I have to call this get time function in both my button presses, right? So, and I could put them anywhere I want. Put them at the end. I can call the get time function here and here. So every time I press the hello button, everything happens, and then get time gets called, which should print after all is said and done, should print something to that label. And then the same thing happens if I press the goodbye button. Eventually the get time function gets called and it should print something to that time stamp label. So let's see if that works. Yeah, there we go. So 2047, so it's 8:47. If you don't like 20, you can do some stuff like could do stuff like this really quickly. If hour greater than 12, let PM hour equal hour minus 12. Is that the right one? Yeah, that's the right logic. And then I can actually print PM hour instead of hour. And then else. Do this. So, you know, this little, hey, I'm going to create another variable here that just subtracts 12 from the, you know, those PM hours, and then print that one, keeps me in the single digit. So let's see if that works. So instead of 20, I wanted to say 8:49, right? I think this will do it. So it's 8:49 here, it tells me, so I can say Jake, hello, and then it prints 8:49. And, you know, I think I can add like, I can add PM here, and I can add AM here because of this logic. So actually, I think I do need the logic for the AM and PM. I run it one more time. Yeah, 8:50 p.m. works. And the input label is telling me that I'm not. 8:50. Yeah, I think that's good enough. All right, I'm gonna stop here. Any questions about any of this stuff? Notice how like these buttons and everything kind of lands nicely. Spacing is right. That's because of all the constraint work that we did earlier. Like all these have constraints. This last extra credit function, pretty straightforward. You had to just look up how to create, a date object and a calendar object, and then how to pull out the hours and minutes out of them. And then this is a little bit of logic to do AM and PM, which should be pretty straightforward. And then I have to call it every time I press the button. I have to call that function. So it gets the time, creates a date object, finds the hour and the minute of the current object, and then does this and prints to that label. I think I've posted some version of this solution already to Blackboard, so you guys should have this code by now. All right, I'm gonna stop here. I think it's a good time to take a break. We come back at 9 o'clock, and we'll look at image views and we'll talk about Lab 5.